delighted to be joined once again by Theo, who is going to do a bit of an introduction to himself and his channel in a minute. This is our second conversation on the channel. And of course, I'm in Odessa, and Theo is in Kyiv at the moment. And that's going to form one of the centerpieces of this conversation today. That is the protests that are unfolding and his eyewitness account as a sort of a foreigner, someone who is also, I would say, sort of politically active, aware, activist mindset, the sort of impression that was gained from seeing those protests, I think would be really interesting to share. Well, before we jump into it, I strongly recommend you connect with his channel, subscribe, follow. It's one of the up-and-coming podcasts with really interesting guests, really interesting material. Well, we'll have a little bit of a menu of that later as well. You can describe some of the interviews you've done, which are absolutely fascinating, including with Chechen opposition, which I'm absolutely intrigued about. Before we do, quick reminder to everyone, it really helps to make sure you're subscribed, not just to my channel, but to Theo's as well. And of course, there are things like Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, etc. Creating all this content, we can only do it with the generous support of the audience. So thank you to everyone who does that. And of course, helps to make trips like the one Theo's done and my trip to Odessa possible. It really wouldn't be possible without your generosity and support. Right, let's get into it. Intro, please, Theo.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me today, John. So my name is Theo Allthorpe-Mullis. I'm a former police officer for 7 years in London. Now I'm an independent journalist. I run a project called Dictators v Democrats. You can find the YouTube channel of the same name and a Substack where you'll find my writing. As part of that project, I run a podcast called Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. And in that, I interview freedom fighters from around the world. I get their human stories. I get what democracy means to them, what they're fighting for. And I also get the messages and impressions that they have to send to us in the West who live in established democracies. Welcome to Dictators v Democrats. I am Theo Allthorpe-Mullis, reporting from Kyiv, Ukraine, on the second night of protests against Law 12414. What you see behind me is democracy in action. Ukrainians are out protesting against this legislation, which critics say pulls far too much power in the office of the president. The two anti-corruption agencies, NABO and SAPO, have now had their leaders amalgamated into the office of the Prosecutor General, which is appointed by the president, where previously they were entirely independent organizations. Now, the president has said that these organizations were ineffective and that they were filled with Russian agents, and that this change in the law will make them more effective. However, people, as you can see, are not happy about it. People are worried and they're having their voice heard. And the difference between dictatorship and democracy is that this could never happen in Moscow, in Beijing, or in Tehran. And it is happening here behind me now. There are maybe 3 times more people here than there were last night. There are thousands here near Maidan Square, Ukraine, and it does not look like this is going to come to an end anytime soon. This is the first serious challenge from within Ukraine, from civil society, that President Zelenskyy has faced since the start of the full-scale invasion. However, one thing is clear. Ukrainians are united in fighting against Russia's imperialistic and genocidal invasion of their country. They may have political debates at home, but on the front lines, they are as one. And that really is the strength of democracy. You can debate, you can talk, you can protest, you can hash things out without having to rely on prisons or riot police. And that is why democracy is non-negotiable. Thank you very much indeed. If you enjoy this, do like, subscribe, share, and remember, democracy is non-negotiable. Thank you very much.
I think this has been an extraordinary reminder this week. And what I find fascinating about it, these protests in Kyiv have confused several bunches of people. I think foreign journalists have really struggled to cover these and actually make sense of the protests. I think you also have actually activists, even some of the NATO community, who are extremely pro-Ukraine, but almost have placed Zelenskyy on a kind of pedestal. He's constantly referred to as a modern Churchill, and yes, he is. I think everyone forgets as well that Churchill himself was a deeply flawed figure who made tremendous numbers of mistakes.
Enormous numbers of mistakes.
Enormous mistakes. And his mistakes are commensurately huge because of the issues he had to deal with. But his successes outweighed those, and indeed his sheer determination to fight fascism, to fight dictators, to not relinquish to them, and the understanding, based on that theory of feeding the crocodile, absolute political and moral clarity, not to appease in any way or succumb, because then everything's lost. Your values, freedom, everything goes down the toilet. And I think people forget that Zelenskyy also was a flawed figure when he came into power. Many Ukrainians, in fact, all Ukrainians I've met say, well, I didn't vote for him, but he's done better than I expected. But that doesn't mean they put him on a pedestal. But that a lot of activists fall into that trap.
They have, unfortunately, and it is something I've seen with the NATO community, which I'm glad to count myself a member of. I have a cartoon dog. Ukrainians, as far as I can see, they don't go in for cults of personality, and they recognize that Zelenskyy is human and can err. And in this case, with the changes that were proposed to how Nabu and Sapo were governed under Law 12414, the Ukrainian people were pretty unhappy about it. And for your audience, this was a change that would have brought these two previously independent anti-corruption agencies that were set up in the wake of the Revolution of Dignity under the auspices of the Prosecutor General, which is a presidential appointee. And the Prosecutor General would then have the power to have directorial control over anti-corruption cases. And Ukraine has, due to its Soviet occupation, an unfortunate and very painful struggle with corruption for many years now, and to a certain extent, to a lesser extent now, that does still continue to this day. So it's a very deeply emotive and powerful issue for Ukrainian people. They understand that their country struggles with this, and they fear any political control over anti-corruption agencies or investigations. And it must be noted as well, though, that the proposed change would bring it in line with countries like the United States, which advised Zelenskyy not to pass this law in a slight twist of irony. But the United States is not Ukraine. And people came out on social media and in the streets in their many thousands and protested against Law 12414. And some of the reporting that I've seen in the Western press has been talking about Zelenskyy, has been hinting that, or maybe his time is up. The protests were not about President Zelenskyy, nor were they about the government's conduct of the war. They were about
not questioning the legitimacy, and we'll come to that in a minute, because in no way were they questioning the legitimacy of the government, because as everyone knows, it's constitutionally illegal to hold elections at this point, and deposing the government would create extraordinary constitutional crisis for which I'm not sure it's really geared to resolve at this point in time.
Yes, although it also has to be noted that Zelenskyy is a political figurehead. He is not leading. He's a civilian. He's not leading the the campaign in the defense of Ukraine. He does represent Ukraine abroad, and he does lead the government. But the fighting is being led and directed by the chief of staff. So if he were to resign or be replaced or anything like that, yes, it would be a constitutional crisis, depending on how it happened. But Ukrainians wouldn't stop fighting the war. This is not about the war. This is about essentially a political issue at home, a political misstep, perhaps, on the part of President Zelenskyy, and one that was, after a few days of protest, fairly quickly reversed once he realized that it was so deeply unpopular. As you can see behind me, this is the second night of ongoing protest here in Kyiv, and the crowds are probably about 3 times the size. Zelenskyy has... And this is something that we're not really seeing accurately reported.
And of course, I mean, you talk about dictators and Democrats. This has highlighted perhaps something for me, which is this isn't just the media, but I think this has percolated down into the public because of decades of sort of media positioning of this. We seem to see the world through the lens of great people, and of course there is a strand of historical narrative that was challenged in the 20th century when you started to get more histories written of technology, society, culture, and deeper processes, rather than just looking at the world through the lens of great leaders and tyrants and whatever. But it does seem that our media is fine-tuned these narratives to try and interpret the world through villains, martyrs, victims, and it. When it comes to Zelenskyy, he's either vilified or placed on an impossible pediment. That suggests to me, and this isn't just the press, unfortunately, it suggests that our concept of democracy and freedom is in some way infantilized. It is declining in maturity if we can only see the world through these kind of cliched personas. Whereas Ukrainians have a far more complex, perhaps even far more healthy view of their government and leaders. It's like those leaders have power. That power is contingent on them representing what the people want and listening to the people and reflecting that. And it seems that Ukrainians are extremely fine-tuned to the point where leaders no longer reflect that. And if that break becomes too substantial, they're gone. I mean, Ukrainian history in the last few years shows that this mechanism is extraordinarily sensitive when it gets out of whack of, let's say, some kind of social or political contract with the people. But it's not written down. It's a culture of democracy.
The Ukrainians, I feel, have as a nation read their Hannah Arendt. They understand that power is a contract, and that it is a contract made between those who have power exercised upon them with those in power, and the onus lies with those who have power exercised upon them and can be withdrawn at any moment. And this was not a withdrawal of consent, it was a message. And the message appears to have been heard. And it's what I said in my reporting from the ground, which I put up on social medias, TikTok, etc., that what we were seeing was democracy in action. And it was. People came out under martial law to go and protest a piece of legislation that they disagreed with. And because of days of pretty constant protests, and the first day, on I believe it was the 22nd, there were a couple of thousand people in the square, and then the next day that trebled, and the crowds were huge. And I think there's something to be said as well for the physical bravery of the Ukrainian people in going out and doing this. And Tim Snyder talks in on tyranny, and one of the rules is to be as courageous as you can. Ukrainians as a people are pretty courageous. a few thousand people in a square in a time of war where the enemy has access to precision weapons that could hit that within 15 to 20 minutes if they wanted to fire something like a Kinzhal, is brave. And the Russians could have, and they didn't, because they thought that they could propagandize, and they have attempted to propagandize the protests against Law 12414. I'm just going to call it the law, the Nabu law, maybe, to make it a little bit easier. But the Ukrainians still went out and they protested, despite the risks. And they stayed protesting after the midnight curfew. They weren't cleared from the square. The government didn't attempt to move them on because they knew that this is the people's right to protest. If enough people come out and say, no, 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 you're going too far, this is a bad idea, you have to hear them out. Because this
and propagandists had a problem, though. They still have a problem in how to position this, because the only way I think the Russian propagandists can usefully, in their terms, position this is if this can be spun as people objecting to the war, objecting to mobilization, objecting to what it would try to label as a war of, the corrupt Nazi leadership, etc. And they try to sort of, stoke that division with the people. But everything about this protest was designed not to be populist, not to challenge the legitimacy of the government, but, as you say, express a democratic will, reinforce the accountability. This is not just a difficult message for Russian propagandists to weaponize. It's impossible. They cannot tell their own people that, one, the people can come out and demonstrate their will, and two, the government almost instantly caves and reacts. I mean, there's nothing they can do with this because it's like kryptonite for their system.
Yeah, it is. And I actually, and it's something I find, I take issue with in all politics in the democracies. I must take you up on the use of the word caved.
Yeah.
They listened.
They responded, yes.
They responded. And to caved suggests a weakness, a lack of will, and that's not that. The Ukrainian people made their objections known, and to not listen to them would simply be stubbornness, and that would be undemocratic. And as I said in my reporting from the ground during the protests, and this is an issue for the propagandists for Russia, you could never see this happening in Petersburg or Moscow. No. If you did, Oman would be out in moments. People would be arrested and beaten in droves. And something that struck me on the ground there, I'm a former police officer, as I said earlier, I've attended public order events to police them. The police presence was minimal. I saw on the first night 5-ish, maybe, police officers for an event of a couple thousand. And I was informed by another journalist that, oh, they are here, they're just keeping out of sight around the corner. I was like, well, that's probably a good idea.
Is that sensitive, sophisticated? I mean, what's your impression of how it's handled?
I think that was quite sensitive on the police's part. I think they came out a little bit later, but in the United Kingdom, the presence would have been larger, and I think it was a good decision from whichever police officer happened to be in charge, because the protests were peaceful. They never attempted to, I mean, where the protests were is about as close as you can get to the presidential offices, and the road leading up to the presidential offices at the moment is a military sector, right? So there's a line of barricade, and at no point did any of the protesters attempt to, that I saw, breach that barricade. They, even without any direction, created a little circle area for all the journalists to be in, and then and there was nobody like making this happen. This appeared to happen organically. And the line was sort of chosen by the crowd, and journalists were all in front of the line, moving around it, taking photographs, doing interviews, etc. And this was a patriotic protest done well. Most of the chants were, repeal the law. That was the first. That was the second night. Don't sign it. No to law 12414. It was all about the law, apart from Putin Julio was pretty common, and the Ukrainian national anthem was also pretty common, and the demographics as well of the protesters was, to me, quite striking. They were young, aged 15 to early 20s in the majority, a lot of young women, because of course a lot of the young men are away, and a lot of veterans. I'm here in Kyiv, Ukraine, and what you see behind me is the work of democracy in action. After the Rada passed the controversial law 12414, a significant defanging of NAPC, the Ukrainian anti-corruption department, people have come out to protest against it. Now, the law has not yet been ratified by Zelenskyy, but people here say that it would never have gotten this far without Zelenskyy's knowledge and possibly his consent. And they have come out in there, at the moment it looks like a couple thousand, to protest against this move and to encourage the government to keep anti-corruption activities going. There are concerns that this centralizes power in the office of the president, and it represents a growing authoritarianism here in Ukraine. However, as you can see behind me, many people have come out to protest from all walks of life, from veterans, serving soldiers, students and civilians. They are here exercising their democratic right to be heard and for their grievances to be known. Now, that would simply not be happening if this was Moscow or Beijing or Tehran. And that is what makes the difference in the dictators and the democrats of the world. And while there is a grievance, while there is controversial legislation being passed and there are concerns, the people have the right, and some would say the duty, to come out and let their voices be heard and protest against it. That is why democracy is non-negotiable.
And it was key, isn't it? That many of the younger people will have grown up with stories of Maidan, but were too young to actually be there. So if I call it a sort of Maidan cosplay, that's very that's a sort of negative spin on it. But there is certainly an element of kind of nostalgia, or this is our turn. We want our revolution too. That's not to say the issues they're fighting for are trivial. They're absolutely not. They're at the heart of democracy. But I really think there is this sort of pent-up desire, especially in wartime and after COVID, that generation have been denied, in some ways, all sorts of experiences, including this active participation in politics. And here it is, and it's just burst forth.
Especially especially young Ukrainians in their 20s. I mean, they had COVID through school, and then basically as soon as COVID ended, the full-scale invasion started. Their formative years been absolutely disrupted by the pandemic and then by the storm and the disease of imperialism and war. And they are very politically active, and it's quite good to see, because Ukraine, I have a lot of hope for Ukraine once the victory comes. I think it's going to be a dynamic and powerhouse of a country once, and if all things are done well, as they are being done, and this is an example of that. Ukrainians are Democrats. They are interested in creating a vibrant, healthy, liberal democracy. And Ukraine has liberalized so fast. It's dynamic, it's young, I mean, if you want to invest anywhere, invest in Ukraine.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because when you look at Poland and you look at especially driving through, and even in the areas which perhaps have had a little less investment than others, whatever, there's an extraordinary economic dynamism in Poland. But you can also see it in the way that the streets are built and they're clean, and the way they're gradually getting through and renovating old buildings. And you went to I just had the impression there's a lot of seaside towns in Britain that are really run down, and yet when you go to some of the towns in like Gdansk, for instance, and others, there's this extraordinary revival in a very short space of time. So they've combined the sort of rule of law frameworks of the European Union, which are incredibly important, with being able to tackle corruption, create more of a level playing field for capitalism to work its magic. And it's had a huge, tremendous physical effect on the environment. Ukraine clearly has not had that. You don't see too many buildings that are renovated. You don't see many, if any, new buildings from the last 40 years, 30 years since independence. But you do see lots of cafes and businesses springing up. So I think the next step would be for them to benefit from rule of law framework, really tackling corruption at every single level. And I think you're going to see a remarkable catalyst of change here, because there's parts of the country that still feel incredibly sort of Soviet in some ways, and with this sort of incipient dynamism just waiting to break through. But a lot of places remind me of Russia in the 1990s when I was traveling there. They really still have that Soviet feel clinging to a lot of places.
Yeah, and the devastation from the war, which rolls across the country like a wave from the east, and it laps against Kyiv. And the further east you go from Kyiv, the worse things get, and more bombed out buildings you'll see. And until you get to near the front lines, when you can begin to smell the acrid smell of warfare. And this is what's holding Ukraine back now. It's this imperialist invasion, this imperialist genocidal, awful, awful war. I mean, it's thundering this morning in Kyiv, and I'm laying in bed. I'm like, is that thunder or is that air defense? I don't quite know.
Well, we had it last night as well, rolling across the Black Sea, and it was like, is that thunder, lightning? Is it as the guys who is in the forces? Well, that could be them just blowing up mines, because there's a lot of sea mines, which and there's this process of trying to destroy them. Or it could be air defense just being triggered by something, or we could be hearing that all the way out in Mykolaiv. He wasn't quite sure whether the noise would carry that far, but hearing that rolling, distant thud sound, and there's been in two air alarms just this morning. Just before breakfast and just after. So it's a constant reminder of Russian aggression, which is relentless.
It is relentless, and last night was quite a loud night. There were drone and cruise missile attacks basically across the country, including here in Kyiv. And this morning there was a Kinzhal launch, which is why there were air alerts. Kinzhal being the hypersonic.
Іди за мною. От Шевчук. Ти нашлась.
Так, достатньо.
we stop this as people in the West, as Democrats, is by offering our full support to Ukraine. And there are plans to stop the bombing of Ukrainian cities. There's the Sky Shield plan, which I think needs serious looking at if we want to be a serious ally to Ukraine, because other countries enjoy the assistance of our air forces in shooting down cruise and ballistic missiles from their enemies, particularly in the Middle East. Why do we not do the same on our doorstep when it wouldn't involve Allied or European jets facing any VKS or Russian Air Force aircraft? It would simply involve Eurofighters, etc., shooting down ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, well, not ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and Shahed drones. And so for your audience, the Sky Shield plan is a plan to divide Ukraine into 3 sectors. And in the green sector, very further to the west, basically Kyiv, west and west of Kyiv, European aircraft would patrol as a combat air patrol and shoot down Shaheds, etc. And there would be no chance of any interaction with the Russian Air Force because the Russian Air Force simply can't get that far into Ukraine, and air-to-air missiles that the Russians have can't get that far either.
And this is the thing I think a lot of people miss, is that Russian crimes are only limited by Ukraine's ability to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
If they had total impunity, we would see a phenomenal scale of suffering.
Enormous, yeah. And this is when the war comes to an end and when Mariupol is liberated, this is what we will see there. And when the investigators are finally able to reach these places, there will be a most terrible reckoning with what Russia has done in the temporarily occupied areas of the East, which are devastated, hollowed out by imperial exploitation and kleptocracy, and many thousands likely to have been murdered. I mean, we can see satellite images from Mariupol of grave sites being dug at a terrifying rate. Mariupol is not a city on the front line. It's not currently a city that's being fought over. So why, years after it was seized and occupied, are they still digging enormous numbers of graves there?
That's one wonders whether there'll be anyone left to tell the stories, and whether the forensic evidence will be sufficient. But yeah, anyone who's seen the film, 20 Days in Mariupol, will have at least a sense of maybe touching the edges of the suffering that's going to eventually come to light. But the criminality is on a scale that is entirely comparable with the Nazis, entirely comparable with what happened in the 1940s. It's a regime of the same character, and if they were given the free rein, they would be able to sort of hit those numbers as well. And I'm not sure Europe quite as woken up to that. That there's no limit to their criminality, none.
And this is actually why this segues actually quite nicely into why I'm currently in Ukraine. I'm doing a story. I'm making a film about Drozar Dudayev, the Ichkerian, or better known as Chechen leader during the 1990s, who fought against the Russians in the First Chechen War before his assassination in 1996. He warned us. He gave a very famous interview, and I encourage your audience to look it up, where he describes the current course of events with unerring accuracy. We were warned then by him. We were warned again by the journalist John Sweeney during the Second Chechen War, when he described Putin as a war criminal, and it was very impolitic to do so because he was our good friend in the war on terror. We were warned again by the Georgians. We were warned in 2014. We have been warned by all of our Eastern European allies who have experience with Russian imperialism that the Russian Empire and the Russian imperial mentality has never ended. And in our arrogance and in the heady post-Cold War peace dividend, end of history and the last man, etc., we didn't want to hear it. And we got slapped in the face for our arrogance. And it is well past time that when those with experience talk, we should listen and we should act, else we're going to be the ones with the experience. If we don't want to be digging trenches outside Tallinn, well, they already are digging trenches outside Tallinn.
They are digging trenches. They've just withdrawn from the landmine treaties because
and we have
defense of their people is now existential.
And this is something that is generational. This is a generational threat. So no, Russia is not currently able to invade or attack NATO. Its military is hollowed out. Its economy is a slowly crashing car. However, Ukraine falls, God forbid. Russia manages to take this territory and all of the people and economic wealth in it. Give it 30 years from then, Russia's imperial ambition still is in place, and we will have to deal with that. And it will not be stopped unless it is stopped. And this is, again, this is going back to what you said earlier, the alligator, Churchill, appeasement. You cannot appease an idea like this.
And it's the process that Ukrainians warn us about, which is already happening with the abducted children, the brainwashing. And now some of those children have already been inducted into the Russian army, bang on the age of 18. And some have been sent to fight against the citizens of their own country. Some have even died now.
Yeah.
This is what happened in Chechnya. That's what they did with Chechnya. We have an example of it.
And it's monstrous. It is. I struggle to think of something this moustache-twirlingly evil than taking a child from their home, brainwashing them, and then forcing them to fight against their compatriots. It is shocking. And I don't think we can quite grasp it, because I think in the West, we have lived under this misapprehension of peace and quite comfortably in our democracies. That's not to say we don't have issues. We do, and they need to be tackled and dealt with. But I think we've almost lost sight of the brutality that we would encounter in any other system. And there's something that I always ask of my interviewees is, what do you have to say to those in the, especially young people in the established democracies, who are losing faith with that system? And one of the best answers from the war reporter, the photographer Paul Conroy, I'm not going to try to do a Scouse accent, but he said, "Oh, I can give you a tour of where democracy has died, and you won't like what you will find." And we can see that in Russia. Russia's experiment with democracy lasted from 1991 to the shelling of the Duma, 2 years. After that, it all fell apart. If it even ever really tried. I mean,
the trouble was the shelling of the Duma, and the Duma was being used as a proxy for the KGB to try to take back the country. So that's not even really a story of Democrats versus whatever. No, it's not. Even Yeltsin riding the tank. And I think there were genuine, there were genuine protests and people genuinely coming onto the street, doing what you said earlier, Timothy Schneider, in 1991, people
Being
came on the
courageous.
streets, they took their lives in their hands, indeed some people were killed. That was the closest Russia came, I think, to anything even approaching Maidan, where people, out of a sense of sort of this can't go on, wanted to express some kind of agency. And then you had Yeltsin on the tank, etc. But in that image, standing behind him was a KGB handler.
Yeah.
And the storming of the TV tower, again, what appears to be an entirely organic process of pushing back against those who are seeking to return it to autocracy. History may well show that it wasn't entirely organic. Some people were protesting, thinking, and acting in a fully natural way, whereas some of the actions that brought Yeltsin to power quite possibly were with the connivance of elements of the security intelligence services. So I'm not sure there was a point of organic democracy at all. I don't think they've even got close to it.
I don't think that Russia in its current form can. And I say its current forms in its current geographic makeup. Russia is Europe's last great empire. And people often don't consider it such. They just consider it a big country, and they consider somebody from a Nenet or a Buryat or a Tatar or a Chechen. They just consider them a Russian. They're not.
Yes.
These are colonies. And in the West, we consider an empire, well, look at Britain, look at France, a country with dots abroad. Russia doesn't look like that, so it's sometimes hard for us to conceptualize that it is in fact an empire. And one thing I also know, how does a country that borders Poland and North Korea work without being an empire? And people forget
and containing hundreds of nationalities, many dozens of which have been genocided out of existence.
Exactly. Languages have disappeared. Cultures have disappeared. And people talk about, oh, well, in Eastern Ukraine, they're ethnically Russian. Yes, many were, because the Ukrainians were murdered and the Russians were shipped in, or the Ukrainians were deported. And this is something that you see in the Baltic states as well. This is something that you see all over the former Russian Empire. And to be a democracy, you cannot also be a colonial empire. And you cannot have bands of citizenship. And this is something that Ahmed Zakayev, the prime minister in exile of Ichkeria, that's Chechnya, talked about in my interview with him, which is going to be in the film. And this is something that Sheikh Said Ismagilov talked about in the first episode of my podcast. And he's an Islamic cleric in Ukraine. He's also a fighter. He fought in Bakhmut, and he liberated his own town of Bucha. In Russia, there are different grades of citizen. An ethnic Russian from Moscow or Petersburg is above a Muslim from Chechnya, who is above a Nenet or a Siberian. And you can see that in who is actually fighting in Ukraine. It is, I think, more so now because the manpower shortages in Russia are pretty significant, although they do have more men than the Ukrainians.
This is the curious thing about Russian imperial mechanic, is that they would say, but hang on a second, you have Armenians, you have people of all sorts of extractions at the very height of society, as journalists, as actors, or whatever, ignoring the fact that all of these people have had to renounce almost entirely their ethnic identity and really proclaim themselves as Russian. And when they talk about their previous ethnicity, it quite clearly has to be put on a different tier or turned into some sort of parody version. It can't have any agency. So yes, you can succeed in Russia as a non-ethnic Russian, but you have to become a Russian in order to do so.
Yeah, there's no room for real pluralism in any area of any significant power or success in Russia, and they will point to the real ethnic diversity that Russia has, but that's ethnic diversity in an exploited workforce that is now being sent to die in their droves on Ukrainian drones. And there are many nations within Russia which have exiles abroad who want to see their home nations become nations again, who haven't had the opportunity for dozens, if not hundreds of years. And this is something that we have to come to terms with, and we have to get over this fear of a breakup of the Russian Federation, because I think that is the only way that we don't see this again in 30 or 40 years' time, once they've had a chance to recover.
Or far sooner than that, in some ways, because the history of Putinism is the history of almost endless wars on different scales. I doubt whether we'd have to wait that long. They need to exist in a state of almost continuous warfare. It may not be at the full scale and intensity of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, but I don't think there's been a year of peace under Putin, and there's unlikely ever to be. Just to conclude, though, what's your plans for your channel in terms of growth? Who have you got lined up, and what sort of direction are you going in with your content?
So I have essentially three vectors for my content. I have a Substack where you'll find my writing. That's Dictators v Democrats. On there, you'll get analysis. I do a weekly roundup. If you fancy a read, go there. I have a small YouTube channel, very small at this stage, and that's growing. You'll find all the episodes of my podcast there. And of course, you'll find my podcast, Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight, on all of the other podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, etc. On that podcast, I interview freedom fighters. And that is people who are fighting for democracy, fighting against authoritarianism. I've interviewed soldiers in Ukraine. There's an interesting interview coming up once I get it fully translated with a soldier called Jaconda, who is of the Condor Brigade. He's an officer commanding a drone unit. I have interviews with the current one out at the moment is with the Estonian politician Markham Kelson, who has been to Ukraine a number of times, who reported in Chechnya as a journalist, and he's been sounding the klaxons. But it's also about other parts of the world. So Major Adil Raja, who's a Pakistani major for 20 years before becoming a whistleblower and having to flee to London, now lives in exile there. Another Pakistani, Taha Siddiqui, also living in exile, this time in Paris, and he runs a bar called the Dissidents Club. Georgia, Serbia, and down the line, I have an interview lined up with General David Petraeus. So that'll be in a couple of months' time, that'll be out. And what I'm hoping to grow
That's a very good one. He's very difficult to get hold of, so congratulations on that one.
Tips and tricks, find him in a bar. Yeah, pin him down in a bar, get a selfie, and then ask for an interview. This is the way. As for the channel, so the YouTube channel will have rather similar to my Substack, but videos. So analysis, news. I recently did quite a short 6-7 minute piece on Elon Musk turning off Starlink in 2022 and asking the questions, well, if he had been a US industrialist during World War II and had done a similar thing before the US entered the war, what would they have done?
Isn't there a story about him doing it again just last week? I would check that out if I were you, but he seems to have
SubStack
been at it.
had a failure last week, but we don't know if he was. I mean, I do ask the question in the piece. You know, is that just a technical glitch, or is it Musk turning it off again at the height of Russia's summer offensive and the possible
Yes.
encirclement of the city
Yes,
of Pokrovsk? Because Starlink is essential. And if Musk wants to play those games and make himself an international actor, then perhaps he should face those consequences. And the channel is going to grow with more interviews, news, analysis, etc. And eventually I want to grow it into a multi-platform channel where I discuss, analyze democracy, the conflict against it being carried out by all of these unpleasant people, you know, the crinks, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all of their useful idiots in the West, but also individuals at home who no longer have faith in it, or for financial reasons are no longer Democrats. Elon Musk, for example, could not accurately describe that man as a Democrat, and he comes from a long line of undemocratic thought in his family. His father went to Russia on the propaganda tour, and his grandfather was a supporter of apartheid in South Africa. Pretty unpleasant reading once you get into that family's history. Because democracy to me is non-negotiable, and it is at the moment at war, under threat, and people are losing faith in it. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. Economically, we've stagnated, and we need to light a fire under ourselves and remember that it was democracy and the engine, the arsenal of democracy that went a long way towards defeating Nazism. It was democracy that defeated communism in the end. And in a democratic system, we've seen the world rise out of extreme poverty in so many ways and build this world that we now live in and that we're now relatively comfortable in. And if we lose that, we're going to go back to an era of aristocracy, of pseudo-monarchy, where human rights and human dignity, which are the two main things that democracy is so good for, is the right to live your life with as little intervention from authorities as possible, but they're still there to provide a safety net if things go terribly wrong, if you get an illness or disaster strikes. And if we lose that, if we lose sight of that, and eventually if we lose grasp of it, quality of life will go down, and we will end, our children will be as serfs. And that's something that we need to fight against. And that's why democracy is so important, because it is the only system that we have come up with so far that provides both abundance and dignity. And without it, we will lose it.
I think that's absolutely vital. Trust, innovation, as you say, creating wealth that is exponential, not just a factor of population and land and these traditional, more extractive things. And I think a lot of authoritarian tendencies can be traced to a lack of this, let's say, sort of democratic industrial thinking, where trust and productivity and innovation are possible, actually essential, and they go hand in hand with the sort of democratic organization and culture.
Yeah,
and Ukraine's got all this stuff in spades, which means it has a bright future. In fact, I think it could well end up being the innovation dynamo of Europe when you combine all these things
I think
together.
So. Yeah. Ukraine is a land of engineers. I was at a school the last time I was here, giving a quick talk to Ukrainian kids as a Briton for their English class. Almost all these kids either wanted to be a computer scientist or an engineer. They're an incredibly innovative bunch, And I think innovation is absolutely what we need to face the challenges ahead. And the biggest challenge that we face as a species, other than, and it is more of a challenge than rising authoritarianism, although the two are linked, is the climate crisis. And we see what happens when authoritarians deal with the climate. And if any of your audience are curious, I would ask them to have a look and see where the Aral Sea went.
Yes.
That's not air defense, that's thunder.
That's a signpost for a future episode. I think I've touched upon it in some episodes, but the Soviet attitude to nature, which is essentially the attitude of a rapist to its victim, is something that's worth exploring in a lot more detail.
I wrote a piece on my Substack on the Aral Sea and comparing it to Australian damming efforts in Tasmania. And if the people living around the Aral Sea had been given any voice, then the destruction of the world's fourth largest lake may not have happened.
Yes, of course, and untold other Soviet crimes against the environment. Well, we're going to do an episode on that, I think, in Ukraine as well, because the environment and the suppression of culture and history is actually intimately linked, especially on the territory of Ukraine. So that's a signpost to a future episode. Today, then, strong encouragement to everyone to subscribe to your materials, watch what you're doing. You're doing some fascinating interviews. You're getting some extraordinary guests and going in directions which I think a lot of podcasts haven't gone in. So, I encourage people to take a look. And I look forward to the chance to talk again.
I look forward to seeing you again. I'm here in Kyiv, Ukraine, and what you see behind me is the work of democracy in action. After the Rada passed the controversial law 12414, a significant defanging of NAPC, the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Department, people have come out to protest against it. Now, the law has not yet been ratified by Zelenskyy, but people here say that it would never have gotten this far without Zelenskyy's knowledge and possibly his consent. And they have come out in there, at the moment it looks like a couple thousand, to protest against this move and to encourage the government to keep anti-corruption activities going. There are concerns that this centralizes power in the office of the president, and it represents a growing authoritarianism here in Ukraine. However, as you can see behind me, many people have come out to protest from all walks of life, from veterans, serving soldiers, students and civilians. They are here exercising their democratic right to be heard and for their grievances to be known. Now, that would simply not be happening if this was Moscow or Beijing or Tehran. And that is what makes the difference in the dictators and the democrats of the world. And while there is a grievance, while there is controversial legislation being passed and there are concerns, the people have the right, and some would say the duty, to come out and let their voices be heard and protest against it. That is why democracy is non-negotiable.
Thank you.